Hello, everybody, and welcome to Community Conversations. My name is Courtney Shaw, and I'm the facilitator of our lecture series on big ideas this quarter. I want to announce that we have a winter series coming up. We're going to be doing our winter series on communications. And if you are interested, keep an eye on our website at lowercolumbia.edu/conversations. We'll be posting a schedule and more information about that as we put it together. But we will be going up to the week of Thanksgiving here. No event on Thanksgiving itself. Then we are on hiatus for finals week and winter break, and then we'll be back in January. Our first event will likely be on January 14th, which is a very auspicious day. If I do say so myself, that's my birthday. So next week, we're going to have Mark Gaither. He's going to speak on self-organized learning experiences as a new trend in education. So please join us again next week for that. And remember that you can also watch the video recordings of any of our events this quarter, as well as we have an archive of lots of events from previous quarters as well. So if you just can't get enough community conversations, there are lots in the archives for you to dig through. This week, I want to welcome Geof Richie. Originally from Anchorage, Alaska, Geof came to Longview in 2014 for a pre-doctoral internship at Northwest Psychological Resources, where he continues to practice today. Geof's practice is listed with the Secular Therapy Project, and Geof teaches general psychology and lifespan psychology here at LCC. Welcome, Geof.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So what I'm talking about today is the next big idea, which for me is, well, here, I'll get you the title screen there. Atheism, the next big idea. I realized as I was putting this together that, as the liberal college professor who's here to give you the skinny on atheism, that I have actually been portrayed by the likes of Kevin Sorbo, David A.R. White, Kirk Cameron. If you're a fan of Christian film, then you've probably seen my character portrayed, although I think I'm going to try to take a different arc than the characters in the movie. I don't desire being hit by a bus anytime soon. So a little bit about me, my personal history, and how I got to this place in my life. First of all, I was raised in the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church was founded as an offshoot of the Anglican Church, which was the Church of England. Henry VIII wanted to get divorced, and the Pope said, no, we don't do that. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury said, why don't make up your own religion, sir? And so he did. And that's where the Church of England got its origins. It's typically more liberal than most Protestant denominations. For example, the Episcopal Church was the first to canonize an openly gay bishop, Gene Robinson. You can learn more about him. When my parents divorced, I was about 10 years old, and my dad started attending a church called Unity Church. So it was along about the same time that I was being confirmed in the Episcopal Church and going through their confirmation classes. I was also getting this whole new idea about theology. It was a New Age Christian church that addressed its deity as Father, Mother, God. The idea was that there was just one presence, the unity, right? There's no God and devil, just the God, one presence and one power in my life in the universe. And so as such, it was also more liberal than other Christian churches. There was mysticism present. They really enjoyed their amethyst and ringing bells and listening to Enya. But there was no punishment doctrine in this church at all. Through high school, I did sort of a self-exploration of Eastern traditions, Taoism, Hinduism, Shintoism, reading the Tao Te Ching and looking at Buddhist practices and whatnot. Eventually, I settled into worshiping the old ones and started practicing pagan traditions in my 20s, but I continued to sort of self-edify when it comes to comparative religion. So I continued to learn about the history of religions. I looked at source criticism. I looked at, parallel thought between different philosophies around the world. And that's how I ended up sort of becoming what I call secular pagan, meaning that there's no real belief behind the practices, but I enjoy the holidays. I enjoy the feasting on Halloween. I enjoy the getting together and spending time with people around solstice and and the fertility rites of the spring and whatnot, and kind of following the wheel of the year as a calendar. I came to that because I had originally kind of thought, well, maybe it doesn't matter what you do as long as you're doing something, and God has a path for everyone. But the more I practiced, the more I realized that this was about the people and my social needs and what have you. And so the benefits of practicing in that way really have more to do with the people in my life. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of world religions throughout history. We have archaeological evidence from before the time that people were writing things down. And one of the very first signs that we see of sort of a religious thought is the Shanidar burials of the Neanderthal people. At the site of Shanidar, they found pits where people were purposely placed into them in the fetal position and surrounded by flowers and fragrant herbs, presumably because no matter what position you put a dead body in, you're going to need some flowers and fragrant herbs. They may have dined near these burial sites too. There's later sites and other places where there's definite evidence that people would come in and dine near the place of the burial. We have hunting magic depicted in cave paintings at Lascaux. The idea is that they sort of kept a record of what they were doing in their families, in their clans, by expressing it in art. And we can see in the art, you have very distinctive sort of paintings of people dancing around what looks like another person dressed in an animal costume. And then next to that, maybe a painting of people dancing around what looks to be like an actual animal represented. And so we think that this is a representation of sympathetic magic, where before a hunt, they would perform these rituals that would help guarantee a good hunt and a good kill, what have you. That leads us to religious specialists, shamans, people who whose job it was within the clan or the tribe to speak to those spiritual and magical sorts of topics and practices, and were in charge of putting together those rituals, and probably would be the person wearing the animal skin in the sympathetic magic rituals. There was a long period of time where we think that shamans were mostly women of high regard in early human development. There was this period of the mother goddess. As a matter of fact, I have at the house a dissertation project from somebody that I got at a conference a number of years ago. It's a beautiful set of 4 posters that just give a timeline of different little goddess statues that we found in Mesopotamia and Egypt and Old Europe. And it shows, kind of the contemporary parallels during the periods of time in which the mother goddess was venerated. For about 3,000 years previous to the biblical period, when you said God, the image that came to people's mind was likely Ishtar or Inanna of the cult of Inanna and Dumuzi from Mesopotamia. So Syria-Palestine is where we start to collect some of those writings and things. So moving past prehistory, in Syria-Palestine, it was a very small area, and it was right next to the Persian Empire. And so you can see that the Persian Empire, if you were to kind of draw on a map the border of the Persian Empire, your pen would cover the area of Syria-Palestine. It's such a small little area there. Syncretism, which I'll define here in a couple of bullet points, was pronounced throughout the Mediterranean at the time. So the religions in Syria-Palestine were polytheistic, meaning that they worshipped pantheons of gods, multiple gods. And because you had different religions and different people and different traditions, the elements of those different traditions would sort of blend and whatnot. There wasn't an exclusive sort of take on religion in the ancient world like there is today. If you convert to a religion, then you get rid of your old religion. Whereas in the ancient world, if somebody came along and offered you a new god to worship, you just added that to your collection of gods or traditions that you had. It was like getting a new friend in that regard. Among them was El, the creator god, chief among the gods, who was said to have lived on a mountain far to the north. In this aspect, there was sort of a hierarchy where you had sort of a chief among equals, which was this El, creator god. Contemporary to that was Baal. Oftentimes people pronounce this Baal, but I think Baal is more accurate, meaning Lord of all. Contemporary to El, and as a matter of fact, there's some evidence that when people said Baal, they were actually talking about El, that there was kind of the same personified deity. But as the tribes and the traditions had their geographical separations, their mythologies began to diverge a bit. A complex rise to power for Baal. At one point, he's tossed into the sea and he has to fight the sea god. And at another point, he's subjected to slavery under Mot, the god of the underworld, and what have you. The Semitic cults were henotheistic, meaning that when they worshipped Yahweh only, they acknowledged that there were other gods that other people worship, and they said there was only one God that is to be worshipped in that sense. And the early Semitic cults worshipped sort of two different chief gods, the Elohim, which seems to have come from El and the Baal traditions, and the Yahweh, which if you look through the book of Genesis, you can see that Elohim and Yahweh are portrayed as very different characters, but we have over time sort of amalgamized them into the same person. And this is where we begin to see monotheism and dualism. Of course, Persia being this huge empire, it conquers Judea, Syria, Palestine, and it begins to influence the religion of the Hebrews. So it was a monotheistic religion. Their prophet was Zoroaster, and they worshiped the god Ahura Mazda. And we start to see the dualism here, because Ahura Mazda was considered the righteous god, and then those who were righteous in this life would join Ahura Mazda in his righteous kingdom in the afterlife, whereas the unrighteous would join Ahriman, the opposer. So the Hebrews adopt the monotheism, but they reject the separation of the dead. They still base their ideas of the afterlife on the idea of Sheol, or the underworld, which was a place that all souls went to rest, whether they were righteous or not. It's just a place for the dead. So how did we get to the place where we think there's a hell? Was it the ancient Jews or the ancient Christians that changed Sheol into hell? It's a little bit unclear. There are some scholars that point to some evidence that there was some punishment and reward doctrines in ancient Judaism, but by the time we get to the New Testament and the Christian period, we definitely see that separation, the parable of the sheep and the goats, the casting into the lake of fire, what have you. What is clear is that Satan, in our modern understanding, appears to be an amalgam of different characters. We've got the Hasatan, or the opposer, from the book of Job. We have Lucifer, who was not a fallen angel as we typically think of, but was actually being referred to, it was a reference to the king of Babylon, who had fallen from grace. Oh, Lucifer, how you have fallen. And of course, we have the contention between El and Baal, where Baal is sometimes referred to as Baal-Zebub, the Lord of all. And in later writings, it's changed by scribes to Baal-Zebub, the Lord of the flies, which of course flies are a reference to death and decay and rot. So it was kind of a slander on Baal. So the modern understanding of Satan appears to be an amalgamation of all these different characters. And the modern understanding of hell generally comes from Dante's Inferno. There are some ancient sources that depict hell, for example, the Apocalypse of Peter, where the Apostle Peter gets a guided tour of heaven and hell, and he sees the tortures that await the sinners that are awaiting the sinners in the afterlife. For example, liars are hung up by their tongues, and adulterers are hung up by, well, other things. And so that's sort of that idea of punishment. But the Apocalypse of Peter is late and legendary. Of course, is considered apocryphal. It's not part of the canon. As it turns out, though, fear of retribution is a good way to keep a lot of people in line. And so the church adopts this going forward. There are some non-punishment traditions. First of all, the Eastern traditions, Hinduism and Buddhism, the idea of afterlife is this cycle of samsara, where there's death and rebirth and reincarnation. The idea of karma, how you live this life depends on what you'll be reincarnated into the next life. And eventually, through the attainment of enlightenment, you can break out of that cycle of samsara and reach nirvana. Pagan reincarnation, especially neo-pagan reincarnation, is the idea that we live our lives and then we sort of take a break in the spirit world. And when we want to, or when we're needed to, we're called back to be born again into a new life in this world. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints talks about a spirit prison, but it's not a place of eternal torture or punishment in that respect. The Anglican doctrine of separation, I think about 1998, the Anglican Church released their document, which says basically there's no literal hell or place of torture. It's just a separation from Christ, and that apparently is supposed to be unpleasant because you don't get to be around the Christ spirit. And then, of course, the doctrine of annihilation, which is that, you know, if you haven't achieved or earned eternal life in this life through your beliefs or your acts, then your soul simply ceases to exist upon your death. There are many indigenous traditions around the world that have different stories of and traditions about the afterlife, almost none of which include any sort of punishment doctrine. But where do your morals come from? Where do your morals come from? It appears that morality evolves over time. Looking back through human history, we can see that things that were okay in history aren't okay anymore, like the owning of people as property. Things that weren't okay in history are okay now, like same-sex coupling. It would appear that religion hinders the evolution of morality and the progression of science. We are a cooperative species. It is to our advantage to work together and be nice to each other. We can see this reflected in our closest genetic kin in chimpanzees and bonobos, both of which are cooperative primate species. And they'll create these autonomous groups that work together, feed together, play together, and whatnot. There's a stark difference, though. Chimpanzees are a bit more territorial. So when an autonomous group of cooperative chimpanzees meets another autonomous group of cooperative chimpanzees, they'll go to war over the territory and the resources. They'll even sneak over to their camp in the middle of the night and just outright murder the other group. Bonobos, on the other hand, when you have a group of cooperative bonobos that meets another group of cooperative bonobos, they go, hey, look at all this food we've got. And then the other guys go, hey, look at all this food we've got. And they kind of expand their territory, share their resources after they have a major orgy, because bonobos are promiscuous. We see evidence of altruism in non-human species. Game animals will run off predatory cats if they attack the young. If they're picking off the dead or the old and the sick, game animals will tend to let that happen. But if they go after the kids, the game animals will group back up in a herd and run those predatory cats back off. There are some bird species that will give warning cries to their fellow birds if there's a dangerous predator in the area. The idea being that, you know, I warn you that there's a predator, and then you be quiet or hide or slip out quietly if you can. But in doing so, I've now drawn attention to myself, which may put me in risk. But the benefit of that is that by calling attention to myself and away from the other members of my bird family that genes that I share in common have a better chance of making it to the next generation because they've survived. Basically, it's good for our survival as a species to be nice and work together. That's what it comes down to. So let's talk a little bit about religious intrusion into US lawmaking. First and foremost, the founding myth is the idea that America is a Christian nation, that we were founded on Judeo-Christian principles, right? The US is not a Christian nation, and our Constitution is not based on the Ten Commandments. Here's a scorecard. Thou shalt not have any other gods. No, we've got freedom of religion. Graven images, no laws about that. Mostly, I don't think there are any blasphemy laws anymore. There certainly aren't any in the Constitution. Remembering the Sabbath day, no. Honoring thy father and mother, not required. Thou shalt not kill. Okay, now we do have laws against killing, but so does every other culture that ever wrote down laws. And that is with or without having Christians or Jewish people to guide those laws. Thou shalt not commit adultery. You could get into some civil trouble with adultery, but not a lot of legal trouble. Thou shalt not steal. Again, every culture that has written down laws has written down laws about taking things that aren't yours. False witness. Now, we do have libel and slander laws, but we also have satire, parody. So, yeah, you can bear false witness. It's not necessarily illegal. Thou shalt not covet. Well, that wouldn't be very good for capitalism. If we couldn't covet, we wouldn't drive the American economy. So no, the US is not a Christian nation. We don't have a national religion. Now, we have a majority population of Christians in the US, so there's that we can say. We're not based on the Ten Commandments. Under God, the phrase was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. By the way, a little tidbit for you, the original pledge was written by somebody who identified as a socialist. In God We Trust was added to US currency in 1956. Both of these appear to be the result of McCarthyism and the sort of hunt for those godless communists to try to get them out of our society. More intrusion. The wedge strategy. In 1999, the Discovery Institute accidentally leaked their document, the wedge document, which was a plan and a strategy to elect evangelicals to public offices in order to try to change culture. They got cooperative churches to come together and to sort of preach politics from the pulpit in the same way, so that they would all vote as a block and accomplish these things. They attempt to change the culture by electing evangelicals to public office. They attempt to insert intelligent design into public school curricula. And they attempt to discredit scientific materialism. So we question what it is that we see with our own eyes and the scientific evidence that we have. The wedge strategy survived and continues today under both names Project Blitz and Freedom for All, which has helped to pass 25 bills in 5 different states. It allows adoption agencies to discriminate on the basis of their religious beliefs. It mandates, at least in one state, that the national motto, "In God We Trust," is displayed in public schools. It allows for Bible classes to be taught in public schools. And there's a strong encouragement for students and teachers to express religious beliefs in schools. Why am I being so hard on the Christians? Well, this is a question that I asked when I first started listening to some of the speakers on the atheist circuit. I was a bit more of a believer in the pagan traditions. They talked a lot about Christianity. They talked a lot about Islam. And they did a fairly good job of sort of refuting the ideas of those religions. But I thought to myself, well, they're not saying anything about paganism. So, obviously they're missing something. Just because they have shown that religion isn't correct doesn't mean that there's no correctness to having a God belief. Well, as it turns out, if I listen a little longer and a little deeper, they do come to talk about things like paganism and whatnot. And I think it was Dan Barker or Michael Shermer, one of which encouraged people to go one God further. They said, everybody in this room is already an atheist when it comes to Zeus and Thor and all of the other thousands of gods that you don't believe in. We're just inviting you to go one God further. So why so much emphasis on Islam and Christianity in particular? Well, it comes to the topic of power and privilege. Right now, 471 of the 538 members of our 116th Congress identify as Christian, according to Pew. And 56% of all state legislators identify as Christian, according to NCSL. Any laws that are proposed or enacted to restrict reproductive rights, adoption rights, hospital visitation rights, property rights, etc., are written, sponsored, and promoted by Christians with religious motivations. Anti-intellectualism is rampant among evangelicals. We have people teaching young earth creationism in their homeschool curriculum. We have people refusing to wear masks to slow the spread of an airborne illness because they don't believe that the scientists are correct, or that it's going to do any good, or maybe that it does more harm than good. The intrusion of Christianity onto American laws is probably the reason why there's so much pushback against Christianity in particular. Now, again, there are some liberal Christian churches out there. The Episcopals, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, all have much more liberal versions of Christianity. So the secular movement, we can trace some writing back to the ancient Greeks. You can see here Seneca saying religion is regarded by the common people as true, by the wise as false, and by the rulers as useful. Seems a bit elitist, but he's not here to defend himself, so I won't counter him. There's a resurgence of atheistic thoughts and writings, and, well, sort of a softening of the talk of God around the period of the Enlightenment. Bertrand Russell was a philosopher and logician and mathematician and historian who made tremendous contributions to the humanities in his career, but also contributed one of the greatest allegories to the counterpoint of atheistic ideas versus theistic ideas, which was the celestial teapot. If you haven't heard of Russell's celestial teapot, it sort of goes like this. There is a ceramic teapot in orbit around Venus, and you can't prove that there isn't. The point that he's trying to make here is twofold. Number one, you can't prove a negative, right? You can't prove a negative even with the absence of all evidence, right? You just say there's not enough evidence. And also that the burden of proof is not on the person who is skeptical, but on the person who is making the claim. So if you were to tell me that there's a ceramic teapot surrounding Venus, I'm not likely to take your word for it. I need to see some evidence. But even in this day and age, if you showed me a picture of a teapot orbiting Venus, we would probably question the validity of the picture. Einstein is oftentimes quoted by apologists because there are some quotes of Einstein's that include a reference to God. But in a letter penned to the Pope, Einstein made it very clear that his idea of God was not a personal deity who oversees the workings of the world or our moral or ethical lives, but that it was more like the God described by the 15th century Dutch Jewish philosopher Spinoza, in that it's sort of a shorthand to reference the laws that govern the universe, the laws of physics and whatnot, things that we're slowly discovering through observation and mathematics. Carl Sagan famously put together the series Cosmos, and I really enjoyed watching that as a child and have rewatched it as an adult. and leaves us with the quote, "Positive claims require positive evidence, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." So if I make the positive claim that I have a dog, it doesn't take much but to show you a picture of my dog for you to believe me. But self-report on something as mundane as a dog is probably enough. However, if I tell you that I have a giraffe, you're probably going to want to see more extraordinary evidence than me just saying, "No, I swear I have a giraffe." And then there's these guys, the four horsemen. They aren't bringing the apocalypse. They're explaining why it's not coming. Throughout the aughts and the teens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchen, and Daniel Dennett began making a bigger appearance in the speaking circles and in the debate circles. For a while, Richard Dawkins was engaging in debates with creationists such as Ray Comfort and Ken Ham, but decided that it wasn't worth his time to give them a platform anymore. Of course, Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist, Sam Harris, a neurologist and philosopher, particularly his particular expertise is in mindfulness. Christopher Hitchens was a journalist, an author, a historian, and quite a charismatic character. The last person I believe to actually have been hired by the Catholic Church to play the position of devil's advocate when they were considering the canonization of Mother Teresa. Daniel Dennett, of course, a philosopher as well. So following these guys, you would hear a lot probably about that Christianity and Islam that I was talking about, but if you follow enough of them, they'll touch on other points as well. Then there's these guys. In our modern day of internet and podcasts and social media, Seth Andrews, who was originally a Christian broadcaster, who was in Christian radio, eventually came to deconvert and now has one of the most successful podcasts out there, The Thinking Atheist. Aaron Ra is an expert in paleontology. I think he's going back to grad school now to get an advanced degree in that. And he spent a lot of time combating the Texas Board of Education on their decisions to change some of their textbooks to include references to things like intelligent design and whatnot. So he spent a lot of time standing in front of the Texas Board of Education, basically delivering evolution to them at the 9th grade level. Matt Dillahunty is a former evangelical deconvert. He is a magician and a skeptic. He was personal friends with James Randi, who you may have heard died last week. But definitely a person in the skeptical movement. Had the opportunity to see these guys back in February before we went on lockdown. It was a great time. They have each in some of their speeches mentioned the satanic panic of the 1980s and the horrors of playing Dungeons and Dragons. So I took the opportunity to have them all sign my Dungeons and Dragons player's handbook. The 10 Commandments versus the Satanic Temple. Well, if you haven't heard about this, there was a statue of the 10 Commandments that was erected at the state capitol in Oklahoma. And after being challenged on this, the courts in Oklahoma decided that it was okay because it was privately funded. Well, that was in, I think, 2012. Then in 2015, the Satanic Temple unveiled this 2.6 meter bronze statue of Baphomet and said, well, this is also privately funded. Can we put it up there? And then the state of Oklahoma really didn't know what to do. I think at one point, a Hindu organization proposed erecting a statue to Hanuman, the monkey god, and the Pastafarians wanted to erect a statue to the flying spaghetti monster. So in 2015, Prescott v. Oklahoma Capitol Preservation Commission, the outcome of that court case says, no, the 10 Commandments, even though privately funded, was not constitutional. So the Satanists of Oklahoma now turn their attention to Little Rock, Arkansas, where there is a Ten Commandments monument in front of City Hall, and that litigation is still going on today. I think they have a court date in November. So outcomes matter, right? And this is why I think it's such a big idea. We've got to have a secular government. The most secular, non-theistic nations outperform the theistic nations on every conceivable metric. The more secular a country, the longer the life expectancy. The more secular a country, the lower the infant mortality. The more secular a country, the lower the poverty. The more secular a country, the lower the crime. The more secular a country, the lower the health problems, including mental health. In more secular nations, science informs policymaking rather than personal belief. And of course, the rise of the nones. The fastest growing religious demographic is people who mark none on the survey sheets. That doesn't mean they're all atheists, but they're unaffiliated. Since 2007, the unaffiliated category has risen from between 12 and 16% to between 23 and 27%. So about a quarter of people surveyed are saying unaffiliated. Church attendance has declined. 70% of US respondents endorsed church membership in 2009, compared to less than 50% currently. There's simply no evidence for the existence of gods, for the existence of an afterlife, for the existence of paranormal phenomenon. There is evidence that secularism solves problems better than theocracy. There's evidence that religion creates conflict and that religion stifles scientific advancement. But what does it all mean? If there's no God and no afterlife, why live? What purpose is there to living? What meaning can life have if it's coincidental, finite, and ultimately insignificant in the universe? Enter philosophy. So the existentialists say, good news. There's no objective meaning, so we get to make up our own subjective meaning to our lives. Likewise, the nihilists say, there's no subjective meaning, therefore nothing has any inherent value, do as you will. And then solipsism, which says, look, man, we can't even prove that we ourselves exist, so why even worry about it? Here's the good news. I hope that I've shown that you don't have to worry about going to hell. Hell was made up by people just like you and me to control other people just like you and me. You deserve to know that. It can be shown. You don't have to take my word for it. The information is there. We have a library at LCC. We know about when hell was made up. We know the people responsible for making it up, and we know why they did it. So good news. Take a load off. Here's the bad news. Every last one of us is going to die, and there's not a damn thing we can do about it. We don't know when, we don't know where, and we don't know how, but we know it's going to happen. The big question here is what happens next? Again, no one knows. We have some pretty good guesses. The evidence that we've gathered in rigorous scientific methodology kind of leaves us thinking that this is all there is. Once we're gone, we're gone. That's the best conclusion we can currently draw from the information we have. This fact alone makes many people wonder if there's any meaning in life whatsoever. Many people scoff at the very idea. They'll insist that science cannot know everything. And you know what? They're right. Scientists will be the first to admit it. You may even be thinking that I'm wrong about what I'm saying right now. I invite you to check it out for yourself. The information is there. You're a scholar. Questioning is your right. But at the end of the day, when you've checked the sources and seen for yourself that our collected, accumulated, vast, lush, rigorous history of evidence kind of points to the idea that we only have this life, you may still choose to believe that there's something more. I won't tell you that you're wrong because I don't know. And anyone who says they do is making it up or repeating something that another person just like you and me made up. I'd love for there to be something more. But if the best information I have is that this life is the only one I'm going to get, then I want to try my hardest to make it the best experience I can have while I get to have it. I want to help others have the best experiences they can have while they can have them. I want to experience as little pain as possible, and I want to help others experience as little pain as possible. We're all in this together. We only have each other. Make it count. Make the most of it. Reduce as much suffering as you can and bring as much joy into the world as possible. And maybe we'll see each other on the other side. I don't think so, but I'm willing to be wrong. I see you now, today, and that's what matters to me. With that, I'll leave you a partial list of atheist celebrities. Any questions?
I have a question actually to get us rolling here. You mentioned the advantages of a secular government as opposed to a theistic one. What are some examples of secular nations that are sort of a good model of this scientific policy making and
the majority of Western Europe is mostly secular when it comes to their government. So if you look at places like France and Germany, you will see that science informs policy, and you can see that with the, just the recent coronavirus numbers that they're outperforming us. Well, most everybody's outperforming us. But definitely places like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway are the most secular nations that we have. And so those are some good examples.
Okay. And as a historian here, of course, I want to jump in and talk a little bit about the Enlightenment and particularly sort of the American Revolution era, which I was just talking about with my classes. We have the model of deism and this idea of God as, a divine entity as a divine watchmaker who set the universe as it was, set up the natural laws, and then departed from the
scene. And then buggered off.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gone fishing is how I like to think of it.
Right.
And this is, of course, something that has a broad American tradition. You have people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin who were proponents of this. Thomas Jefferson actually rewrote the Bible to take out all the miracles because he was.
I have a copy of the Jefferson Bible. It's the life and moral teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, or something is how it's.
Yeah, he's all down with the teaching, not the miracles. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's sort of part of our American culture, that we're sort of trying to marry this idea of an Enlightenment past with, the Second Great Awakening and all these religious movements, and the obviously evangelicalism is a very powerful political force these days. That seems to be, at least to me, one of the big tensions we have right now. Do you see that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. It's not common knowledge, but the founding fathers were mostly deistic, meaning that, they didn't believe in a particular personal God, but sort of this nebulous, great universal deity that, doesn't really interfere with daily life. They were particularly opposed to some of the teachings of the Christian church at the time, and definitely did not want to have that influence in the workings of government. But over time, that First Amendment freedom of religion has given us a myriad of different Christian denominations and Jewish sects and Islamic sects and modern paganism and people practicing Native American medicine and what have you. The conflict that I really see is not necessarily with people that possess a sort of a spirituality about them. It is really with fundamentalism. I gave a talk in December at St. Stephen's, part of the Interfaith Council, about mass shootings and mental health. And one of the things that we found is that there is a real common thread between the right-wing fundamentalist Islamic terrorists who end up committing mass atrocities and the right-wing fundamentalist white Christian males who end up doing mass shootings in this country. So spirituality in and of itself, I don't think is the adversary here. The adversary is fundamentalism. And that point is brought out in Dr. Ryan Cragen's book, What You Don't Know About Religion But Should.
I had muted myself. Yes, and that I think that is also, there's a lot of good poli-sci going on right now looking at authoritarianism, and that of course would be very prominent
Yes,
in.
and authoritarianism tied very closely to fundamentalism, because we have this sort of alpha male, alpha god of the Old Testament. In fact, there's a book by Andrew Torres called Alpha God, which goes into detail about how that sort of permeates American culture.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. We have a question from Dave, who asks, you mentioned an issue with artwork at City Hall, 10 Commandments. Do you know of any movements where religious-based prayer, where Jesus or specific supreme beings before City Hall meetings, for example, have been successfully challenged?
Well, there has been there's some jurisdictions where they don't allow that. It's been highly contentious among the secular movement that we still have an invocation before political events like City Hall meetings and whatnot. There have been some attempts to broaden the spectrum. I think I recall that recently somewhere in Alaska, one of the city council members, I don't remember where exactly, gave an invocation before the meeting and ended with "Hail Satan." There's been Pastafarians that show up to give a sort of a secular invocation at different organizations and whatnot. So, it doesn't really fit the separation clause to invoke deity before a public government meeting, but it's so ingrained in tradition. I think that the way that we fight it is to just begin to expand it to the point where people go, okay, well, if we're going to include it, we have to include everybody, then I don't want to play anymore.
Mm-hmm. I remember reading an article sort of speaking to that, and it was a case in Hawaii of invocations before sporting events like high school football games. And because it was Hawaii, they were doing Buddhist invocations, large Asian American population, a lot of Buddhists. And that became an issue of religious separation. Again, if it's a public school, you can't do that. And it got on board a lot of Christians. And so that sort of turned the tide where it's like, oh, this isn't just about our right to practice a religion or to be free of a religion. This is the right of everybody to practice a religion or be free of a religion. And so that when you are sort of separating yourself from what is the majority stance or the majority population, you see it in a different way. And I think that that's a really valuable way to approach
it. Well, Peter Boghossian calls it the outsider test of faith, right? Yeah. So, if you're talking to somebody and they say, well, I just have this powerful personal experience where I experienced Jesus in my life, and I know it was him because I felt it in my heart, and that's where my belief comes from. And we say, okay, well, I was just talking to a friend of mine who's Muslim who said almost the exact same thing about their experience with Muhammad. Does that mean that they're correct about Muhammad? Well, then you kind of put them in that spot where they have to look at it from an outsider's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for asking questions, and thank you, Geof, for sharing your knowledge and your experience here. And I want to ask you all to join us again next week. We'll keep going with these things, even in weird setups, and whatever way we can. We find a way to connect with one another and share with one another and learn from one another. So thank you.
Let me just flash my references up here real quick. So if people want to go back and review the video and take a look at my sources, there they are.
Excellent. Thank you all.